The desert morning was quiet. The land stretched endlessly across the Arizona territory, where a dry wind moved slowly through scattered cactus and pale desert grass. A narrow dirt trail cut across the open land, leading toward a small ranch sitting alone at the base of a red stone hill. The ranch belonged to Thomas Hale. Most people simply called him Tom. Tom had lived in that lonely place for almost 10 years, long enough to learn the ways of the desert, and long enough to understand that the land rarely gave anything without a price. The ranch was small, just a wooden house, a weathered barn, a rough corral fence, and a water well that had saved Tom's life more than once during the worst dry seasons. It was a hard life, but it was a quiet one. Most mornings, Tom followed the same routine. He woke before sunrise, checked the horses, walked the fence line, and made sure nothing had wandered onto his land during the night. That morning seemed no different. The sun had barely begun rising when Tom saddled his horse and rode slowly across the eastern side of the property. The air was still cool. Dust rose softly under the horse's hooves. Tom followed the familiar trail along a dry wash when something unusual caught his eye, a shape in the sand. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree branch, but as he rode closer, he saw movement. A horse. Tom immediately pulled the reins. The animal lay partly on its side in the dust. Its breathing was slow and uneven. Tom dismounted carefully. The horse lifted its head slightly but did not try to stand. It was a strong animal, tall, dark brown, with a black mane covered in dry dirt, but its front leg was injured. Tom crouched beside it. "Well now," he murmured quietly, "that's not good." The horse watched him cautiously but did not struggle. Tom studied the leg. The injury wasn't fresh. The animal had likely been wandering for days. Its ribs showed slightly beneath the skin. It was exhausted. Tom slowly poured some water from his canteen into his hand and held it near the horse's mouth. For a moment, the animal hesitated. Then it drank carefully. Tom sat back in the dust. "Someone's horse," he muttered, and that meant trouble. Out here, horses rarely wandered far from their owners. Tom looked around the empty desert. The hills were silent. No riders, no tracks he could see nearby. Still, something about the animal bothered him. The saddle marks on its back were faint but visible. This horse had been ridden recently. Tom scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Well," he said quietly to the horse, "can't leave you out here." It took time, nearly an hour of patience and slow effort. But eventually, Tom managed to guide the injured animal back toward the ranch. The horse limped badly, but it followed. By the time they reached the corral, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the desert air. Tom opened the gate and led the horse inside. "There we go." He tied it loosely near the barn and brought fresh water. Then he cleaned the injured leg. The horse stood calmly watching him with dark, alert eyes. "Not a wild one," Tom muttered. "Too well trained," which meant someone out there was probably looking for it. Tom finished wrapping the leg with a cloth bandage. Then he stepped back and studied the animal again. "Guess you'll be staying here a while." The wind moved gently across the ranch. Dust rolled across the open ground beyond the corral and high above the ranch. On the red stone ridge overlooking the valley, a lone figure sat silently on horseback, watching. The Apache warrior had been there since morning, and he had seen everything. The first day, Tom thought it was nothing, just a shadow on the ridge. The desert often played tricks with distance. Heat waves bent the air, turning rocks into shapes that looked almost alive. But the second day, the shadow was still there. Tom stood inside the corral, brushing dust from the injured horse's coat. The animal had eaten well that morning. It was stronger now, still limping, but standing with more confidence. Tom dipped a cloth in a bucket of water and carefully cleaned the horse's injured leg again. "Easy there," he muttered. The horse snorted softly, but stayed calm. It trusted him now. That was the strange part. Some horses fought every movement, but this one watched Tom closely, almost as if it were studying him, as if it were deciding something. Tom tightened the new bandage and stepped back. Then he felt it, that strange feeling, the feeling of being watched. Slowly, Tom turned toward the hills. The red stone ridge stood tall beyond the ranch, and there, at the very top, a rider, still silent. The figure sat on horseback against the bright desert sky, too far away to see clearly, but the outline was unmistakable. Tom narrowed his eyes. "Damn," he muttered quietly. He had seen riders before in these lands, travelers, hunters, sometimes bandits. But this one was different. The rider had not moved all morning, just sitting there, watching the ranch, watching the corral, watching the horse. Tom walked slowly to the fence and leaned on the wooden rail. The wind moved through the dry grass. The rider remained perfectly still. Even the horse beneath him barely moved. Tom felt a slow tension building in his chest. "Apache," he whispered. He had seen Apache scouts before during his years on the frontier. They were patient, silent, and they could watch a place for hours without moving, sometimes days. Tom glanced back at the injured horse. The animal had raised its head. Its ears pointed toward the ridge. It had seen the rider, too. Tom rubbed the back of his neck. Well, that explained something. The horse. It wasn't lost. It belonged to someone. And that someone was likely sitting on that hill, watching him. But something didn't make sense. If the horse belonged to the Apache, why didn't he come down and take it? Why wait? Why watch? Tom stayed at the fence for several minutes. The rider never moved. Finally, Tom raised one hand. A simple gesture. A greeting. The rider did not respond. The Apache remained motionless against the sky. Tom lowered his hand slowly. "Well," he said under his breath, "suit yourself." He turned and walked back toward the barn. But the feeling did not leave him. That rider was not just watching the ranch. He was watching Tom, and most of all, he was watching the horse. The third morning was colder. Thin clouds moved slowly across the pale desert sky, softening the sunlight that normally burned across the valley. Tom stepped out of the ranch house with a tin cup of coffee in his hand. The air smelled of dust and dry grass. Everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. He walked toward the corral, already knowing what he would see. And sure enough, the rider was there again, high on the ridge, exactly where he had been the day before. Tom stopped near the fence and stared toward the hill. The Apache sat on horseback, like a statue against the sky, watching, always watching. Tom sighed and took a sip of coffee. "Well," he muttered to himself, "guess you like the view." Behind him, the injured horse shifted its weight inside the corral. Tom turned his attention back to the animal. The horse looked much better today. Its coat was cleaner. its breathing steady. The leg was healing, though the limp was still there. Tom opened the gate and stepped inside the corral. The horse immediately turned its head toward the ridge. Its ears lifted sharply. Tom noticed it right away. The horse wasn't looking at him. It was looking past him, straight toward the hill, toward the Apache. The animal snorted softly and took a slow step forward. Then another. Tom followed its gaze. The rider hadn't moved, still silent, still watching. Tom scratched his beard. You know him, don't you? The horse took another step toward the fence. It stretched its neck slightly, staring at the distant hill. Then it made a quiet sound deep in its throat, a low, familiar sound, the kind horses made when they recognized someone. Tom felt a slow realization forming in his mind. Well, I'll be damned. The horse wasn't afraid of the Apache. It was responding to him. The animal knew that rider. Tom leaned on the fence again, studying the figure on the ridge. If that's your horse, he paused. Oh, why don't you come get it? The wind picked up slightly, pushing dust across the open land between the ranch and the hill. Still no movement. The Apache remained where he was, patient, waiting. Tom rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. He had lived near Apache lands long enough to understand something important. Apache warriors rarely wasted time. If they wanted something, they took it, especially a horse, which meant this situation was different. The Apache could have ridden down at any time, could have taken the horseback, could have confronted Tom, but he didn't. Instead, he watched, and the more Tom thought about it, the more he realized something else. The Apache wasn't watching the ranch. He wasn't watching Tom. He was watching one thing, the horse, watching how Tom treated it, watching every movement, as if he were judging something, testing something. Tom slowly nodded to himself. All right. He looked back toward the ridge. Now I get it. The Apache wasn't waiting. He was studying him, and Tom had a strong feeling the warrior would keep watching until he made a decision. That night, the desert was colder than usual. The wind moved slowly across the valley, carrying the quiet sounds of the dark. Inside the ranch house, Tom sat at the small wooden table near the window. A lantern burned softly beside him. The injured horse had spent the entire day resting in the corral. It was healing well. Tom had checked the bandage twice before sunset. Everything seemed normal, but the rider had remained on the ridge all afternoon, watching, waiting. Tom had eventually lost sight of him when darkness fell. Now the hill was just a black shape against the night sky. Tom leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. 3 days. The Apache had been watching for 3 days and still had not come down. Tom didn't understand it. But one thing was certain. The horse belonged to that warrior. The question was, why was he waiting? Tom blew out a slow breath and stood from the table. He was about to head to bed when something broke the silence. A sound. Soft. Outside. Tom froze. Hoofbeats. Very slow. Very careful. Someone was riding near the ranch. Tom immediately reached for the rifle leaning beside the wall. The sound came again. A horse stepping quietly across dry dirt. Tom moved toward the door without making noise. He pushed it open slowly. The cold desert air rushed in. The ranch yard was dimly lit by the pale moon above. For a moment, everything looked empty. Then Tom saw him, near the corral fence. A rider, the Apache. The warrior sat silently on horseback just outside the wooden fence. The horse inside the corral had already noticed him. Its ears were raised, its body tense, but it wasn't afraid. Tom stepped out of the house, rifle lowered, but ready. The Apache didn't move. Moonlight revealed the warrior's calm expression. His long, dark hair moved slightly in the wind. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The entire desert seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Tom spoke first. "You've been watching my ranch for 3 days." His voice was calm but firm. The Apache said nothing. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward the horse inside the corral. The animal stepped closer to the fence. It made that same low sound again. Recognition. Tom noticed something then. The warrior wasn't holding a weapon. No rifle, no bow, nothing. He had come alone. Tom lowered his rifle slightly. "You come for the horse?" Still silence. The Apache studied the animal carefully. His eyes moved down to the bandaged leg, then back to Tom. For the first time since arriving, the warrior spoke. His voice was quiet, but clear. "You help him?" Tom blinked slightly. He hadn't expected the Apache to speak English. "Yeah," Tom replied. "Found him injured?" The warrior nodded slowly. For a moment, his gaze softened as he looked at the horse. Then he turned his eyes back to Tom. "He's strong horse." Tom glanced at the animal. "Yeah," he said. "He is." The wind moved gently across the ranch yard. The Apache rested one hand on his saddle horn. Then he said something that surprised Tom. "I watch." Tom frowned slightly. "Watch what?" The warrior's eyes remained steady. "I watch man who finds my horse." Tom said nothing. And suddenly, the last 3 days made perfect sense. The Apache had never come to fight. He had come to judge. The two men stood quietly beneath the pale desert moon. The wind moved softly through the open land around the ranch. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The horse inside the corral shifted its weight and stepped closer to the fence. It was calm now, almost relieved. The Apache warrior watched the animal carefully. His expression carried something deeper than simple concern. It was respect. Tom rested the rifle against his shoulder, but his finger stayed far from the trigger. This was no longer a confrontation. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "How long you been watching?" The warrior kept his eyes on the horse. 3 sons. Tom nodded slowly. "That's what I figured." The Apache looked down briefly at the dusty ground. Then he spoke again. "My horse ran after Storm." Tom remembered the violent dust storm that had swept across the valley 4 days earlier. It had knocked down a section of his fence and nearly buried the well in sand. "Lost him in the storm?" Tom asked. The warrior nodded. "Yes." The horse snorted softly, as if recognizing the sound of his voice. The Apache stepped a little closer to the corral fence, still calm, still careful. "I follow tracks," he continued. "Tracks lead here." Tom leaned slightly against the fence post. "And you figured I stole him?" The warrior shook his head. "No." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Then why watch?" The Apache paused. For a moment, he looked directly at Tom. His dark eyes were steady and thoughtful. Then he turned back to the horse. "This horse," he said slowly, saved my life." Tom remained silent. The warrior continued speaking, his voice calm but heavy with memory. "Many winters ago, soldiers attacked our camp near the mountains." The desert wind whispered across the ranch yard. "We ran into the canyon," the Apache said. "Bullets everywhere, smoke, fear." He gently placed a hand on the corral fence. This horse carried me through the rocks while others fell. The horse inside the corral lifted its head, almost as if it understood the story. The warrior's voice grew quieter. He did not stop running. Tom watched the man carefully. And if he stopped, the Apache continued, I would be dead. Silence settled between them again. Tom slowly nodded. Sounds like a good horse. The warrior looked at the animal with deep respect. He is more than horse. Tom looked at the bandaged leg. Well, he said quietly, he'll run again soon. The Apache studied the bandage carefully. Then he looked back at Tom. You clean wound. You give water. You feed him. Tom shrugged slightly. Couldn't leave him to die. The Apache nodded once. And then he said something that carried quiet weight in the desert air. A man who is kind to a horse is rarely an enemy. Tom looked at the warrior. For the first time since the rider had appeared on the hill, the tension between them was gone. Two men from different worlds, standing under the same desert sky, connected by the life of one horse. When the horse runs again, the moon had climbed higher over the desert. The ranch yard was quiet again. Tom and the Apache warrior stood beside the corral, both watching the horse. For a long moment, the warrior said nothing. Then he slowly stepped closer to the fence. The horse inside the corral moved toward him immediately. Its ears lifted, its head stretched forward. The Apache raised his hand slowly and rested it against the horse's neck through the wooden rails. The animal closed its eyes briefly, recognizing the familiar touch. Tom watched quietly. There was no doubt now. The horse belonged to this man. After a moment, the warrior stepped back. He looked down at the bandaged leg again. You fix him well, he said. Tom shrugged slightly. Still healing? The Apache nodded. Then he surprised Tom. You keep him? Tom blinked. What? The warrior pointed calmly toward the horse. You keep him until he runs strong again. Tom studied the man carefully. You sure about that? The Apache nodded once. If he runs now, he falls again. Tom couldn't argue with that. The horse still limped slightly when it walked. How long? Tom asked. The warrior looked at the animal. Until he is strong. The wind passed gently through the ranch yard. Tom finally nodded. All right. The Apache climbed back into his saddle. Before leaving, he looked down at Tom one last time. You are a good man to horse. Tom smiled faintly. Guess the horse thinks so too. The warrior turned his horse toward the dark desert. Within seconds, he disappeared into the night. And just like that, he was gone. Days passed, then weeks. Every morning, Tom cared for the horse, cleaned the wound, changed the bandage, fed him well. Slowly, the animal began to recover. The limp grew smaller each day. One morning, nearly a month later, Tom opened the corral gate. All right, he said softly. Let's see what you got. The horse stepped forward, carefully, then walked, then trotted. The leg held strong. Tom smiled. Well, The horse was ready. That evening, as the sun sank behind the red desert hills, Tom saw something familiar. A rider on the ridge. The Apache had returned. Tom leaned against the fence and waited. The warrior slowly rode down from the hill. The horse inside the corral saw him first. It lifted its head and let out a loud call. Tom opened the gate. The horse stepped forward. Then suddenly it ran across the open ground toward the rider. Strong, fast, free. The Apache smiled slightly as the horse reached him. He placed a hand on the animal's neck. Tom walked slowly toward them. The warrior looked at him and nodded with quiet respect. Then he spoke one final time. "You cared for him like your own." Tom shrugged. "He needed it." The Apache mounted the horse again. Before riding away, he reached into a small leather pouch. He tossed something gently to Tom. Tom caught it, a small carved stone, an Apache's symbol of respect. Tom looked up, much obliged. The warrior nodded, then turned toward the desert. Horse and rider moved across the open land until they became small shapes against the horizon. Then they disappeared into the fading sunset. Tom stood alone beside the ranch, holding the small stone in his hand and watching the desert grow quiet once again.